The Cognitive Science in Buddhism by Venerable Rungruan Papasaro, Dr. Rungruan Limchu Patipa. The Buddha was the first one who mentioned about the cognitive development in the Buddhism. The words instructed cognition and insight wisdom were interchangeable in the Buddha's teachings. This kind of wisdom is sometimes called the wisdom gained directly from the Buddhist practice. In this circumstance, the process is the cognitive process, and the result of this development yields the wisdom. What makes this wisdom so special than any other ordinary knowledge is that it is not a kind of knowledge that is occasional used when needed or something to be recorded on a book, but it is an insight knowledge that is to be incorporated with mindfulness as an instructed cognition when having a consciousness on receiving stimulus from the world for the destructions of any arising problems in the mind processing. The subject of the cognitive process is very abstract, and it seems to be rarely discussed in most teaching schools. However, the Buddha did explain this cognitive process of mind in several suttas as part of wisdom development. Francisco Varela, one of founders of the modern cognitive science, noticed the essence of the cognitive science in Buddhism as follows.
The essence of the convergence of Buddhism and science that form Buddhism perspective. Life is in fact a cognitive process.
In Buddhism, the origin of suffering in life is caused by an uninstructed cognition, and in order to resolve this problem at the root cause, then we have to develop an instructed cognition of the truths of life within nature. And in the Buddhist practice system, the Buddha explained that a practitioner must have a mindfulness throughout the Buddhist practice, and by doing so, a mindfulness will progressively develop along the whole course of Buddhist practice. The Buddhist cognition requires to have a mindfulness to observe an insight of the mind. Therefore, the quality of mindfulness must be improved along with the practice. The focus of the early part of the practice is about how to improve the quality of mindfulness for performing an insight observation in the four mindfulness foundations, and then the mindfulness will reach a special condition of the mindfulness for an enlightenment, and then after gaining an insight wisdom, the mindfulness will finally become a perfect right mindfulness. In principle, the Buddhist practice is a way to study, and to have a mindfulness experiencing the reality of the truths of life within nature, especially in the part of how a mind responds to the world in terms of mind processing. This technique of study is quite unique, and only available in the Buddhism. In order to make a progression of mind developed, we must follow the Buddha's teachings correctly, that is, when having a right execution, and then the right effect will be accomplished as a result in nature. Therefore, studying the Buddha's teaching on how to perform a process to progressively reach a certain state of mind step by step, is very important in Buddhist practice. And as the Buddha proving a roadmap with intermediate accomplishments in each progressive step, we should make an assessment of the progress, and if necessary, a proper solution with corrective actions is required for an improvement. The Buddhist practice is an experimental journey into the inner mind in searching for the truths of life within nature. It is recommended that we should carefully study the Buddha's teachings as follows.
In Buddhism, the perfect Buddhist practice means to be pleased with hearing the true Dharma. Studying on the Buddha's teachings with careful attention to contemplate on the true Dharma. Having mindfulness to practice in accordance with the Buddha's teachings to contemplate on the Dharma. Investigation on the true Dharma. Having mindfulness accompanied with wisdom for the cessation of all defilements. When performing the Buddhist practice, having a mindfulness meditation, with effort, so that the mindfulness becomes purified with no bias to any arising mental phenomenon, then performing an insight observation on Dharma, and then seeing the truths of life within nature, as what the nature is. This is the way to gain wisdom of knowing what is right and what is wrong, what we should do, and what we should not do clearly. This is the method to gain wisdom in the truths of life within nature. And this is in essence to be called a study in Buddhism.
The Buddhism is a pragmatic religion based on facts and science. The Buddha encouraged everyone to learn the truths of life within nature, so that we can have a better understanding of life, and this is the way to bring peace to the world. The system of Buddhist practice is summarized in the following steps. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to initiate a mindfulness in the mindfulness establishment. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to use the mindfulness to abandon any arising troubling mind in the Buddhist meditation. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how cleanse the 5 hindrances, and then penetrating into the inner mind of the initial thought in the 5 hindrance abandoning. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to abandon the initial thought with liberated thinking in the mindfulness absorption. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to perform an insight observation in the 4 mindfulness foundations. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to apply the 4 noble truths to gain wisdom by applying the 4 noble truths on the observations both in terms of each phenomenon and the whole mind processing in the process of dependent origination. Introspective learning with instructed cognition on how to apply the gained wisdom for the cessation of all kinds of defilement at craving, clinging, and ignorance of the process of dependent origination by wisdom, so that the mind is completely liberated, and making an end to all suffering in life. Note, introspective learning is based on the threefold study strategy in Buddhism, especially in the part of the study on the mind in performing an insight observation. We can say that an introspective learning is an insight observation to learn on the nature of the mind, then developing a cognitive process inside the mind to gain wisdom. As all defilements of mental errors and contaminates that arise within the mind processing are completely abandoned and cleansed out, the process of dependent origination will totally collapse, and then the mind is liberated and purified from any problem, and the individual will be able to respond to the world by taking the right actions, the Noble Eightfold Path, based on the truths of life within nature. And this is what the Buddhism is all about. It is the knowledge of the truths of life within nature. The Buddha introduced a cognitive science to the world more than 2,500 years ago. And it is not until recently with the breakthrough in neuroscience that we begin to study on how the wisdom is developed inside the central nervous system, so-called the cognitive science in the present time.